Yeah, well, oh, yeah, let me say that I've got the recording. There we go. Yeah, so thanks. You definitely will hear more about the interdisciplinarity. In fact, I presume it'll be one of the weirder talks you guys hear, because we're going to be talking about things like colonoscopies and daycare centers. But don't worry, they'll all tie back into marine conservation somehow. Hold on here, let me make sure that works. There we go. So look, scientists often spend their careers looking at averages and trends, and this is really important for discerning the signal from the noise. But today I'm going to highlight an alternative approach to informing conservation that's focused on identifying and learning from outliers, and specifically outliers that are doing well despite difficult conditions. Now, by their very nature, outliers, they deviate from our expectations and consequently can provide novel insights into confronting complex problems where conventional solutions have failed. And the classic example of this comes from Save the Children, working in Vietnam. And they were working on the nexus between poverty and childhood malnutrition. And as you guys can imagine, these two issues are tightly coupled, with poor children tending on average to be much more malnourished than their wealthier counterparts. And so what Save the Children did, which I thought was really insightful, is they went looking for the bright spots. They looked for the poor kids that were not malnourished. And they asked their mothers what they were doing differently than other mothers in the village. And it turns out they were doing a few things. And this included finding little crabs and shrimps in the rice paddies and grinding them up in the kids' rice. They were also feeding their kids 3 times a day instead of the customary 2. Now, they weren't giving their kids more food. They couldn't afford to, right? But by adding these little micronutrients up and then spreading it over 3 meals, over more meals, the kids were better able to absorb those nutrients, and consequently did a lot better. So Save the Children then had these mothers teach the practices to other mothers in those villages, and then had these villages become living laboratories, right? So other villages could come in and learn these practices. They ended up cutting childhood malnutrition by 65% in project villages and reached over 2.2 million households. Now, this type of positive deviance or bright spots analysis has been used in fields such as business and health and human development to uncover local actions and governance solutions that work in the context of widespread failure. And I think it holds much promise in informing conservation. So we use this approach to look for reefs that, for all intents and purposes, should have been degraded but weren't, and find out what we could learn about what they were doing differently. So here's how today's talk is gonna to play out. First, if you're looking for outliers, you first have to understand what are you actually expecting. So first, we'll define our expectations. And then a little spoiler alert, one of the more interesting things that we found was that markets are a really key driver of environmental conditions. And so I want to kind of peel off a little bit, have a little bit of a kind of cul-de-sac on what my research group has really been focusing on in this area. And then we'll kind of come back to talk about locating bright spots, and then what makes a bright spot bright. And this will include a deep dive into one place I've been working for nearly 20 years now. So, look, this topic was way too big for any single discipline to tackle on its own. And so I assembled a working group of nearly 40 scientists from a range of disciplines to really rethink how we need to confront the coral reef crisis. And, you should know that I take interdisciplinarity very seriously. And although I didn't marry an ecologist, I did get married by one, and had several. Some of these may even be familiar in our wedding party. So interdisciplinarity is truly close to my heart. So I began this interdisciplinary project by requesting that 40 different coral reef scientists just give me their life's work. And I actually think that this was successful in part because I was a social scientist and not another coral reef ecologist. And so in this sense, I wasn't really competition for people's primary objectives. This just kind of could be a side project for them that didn't compete with their kind of day-to-day activities. And so I think they were more willing to collaborate on this kind of project because it was interdisciplinary. So just to be clear, this is the largest study of its kind ever conducted, and we gathered data from about 1,800 reef sites in 41 countries, states, and territories. At each site, we looked at things like the amount of fish on the reef, the fish biomass, the presence of top predators, a biodiversity metric called trait diversity, and the potential parrotfish grazing that was happening there, which is a key ecological function. We developed a series of Bayesian hierarchical models to predict variability in each of these indicators based on key environmental and socioeconomic drivers. Now, just to circle back, the bright spots stuff that we'll be talking about a bit later was focused on fish biomass, but I'm going to talk a little bit about these other ecological indicators and what we found as well before we get into that. So we controlled for several key environmental conditions, and these included things like productivity, depth, habitat, sampling area, the method that was used, and sea surface temperature anomalies. We also looked at a range of socioeconomic drivers. Now, I don't have time to go into the sort of theoretical underpinnings of these today, but in short, we were interested in testing the strength of different human environment interaction theories based primarily in sociology and geography. And so I've currently got a paper in review in Current Biology, which is really exploring the sort of theoretical underpinnings of how these socioeconomic predictors relate to the theory. And if you guys are interested in this, we can definitely talk about that a bit more in the discussion, but I don't have time to really delve into it today. But at the larger scale, at the national scale, we looked at things like the Human Development Index, the national population size, and the amount of reef fish that were landed per kilometer of coral reef. At the local scale, we looked at the types of rules that were in place and how well they were complied with, the level of population growth, local human population growth, a metric of local or subsistence pressure, and I'll get into a little bit how we calculated that, and the metric of potential market interactions. And again, I'll tell you guys how we calculated that in just a minute. So, you know, the key finding for me in this part was that these potential market interactions were the strongest predictor of reef fish biomass, but they were also a really strong predictor on the presence of top predators, on trait diversity. However, they weren't a really strong predictor of parrotfish grazing. So these potential market interactions were the strongest socioeconomic predictor of ecological conditions on coral reefs. So I'd like to kind of peel off and talk about this in a bit more depth right now. So to measure these potential market interactions, we use something that all of us are familiar with every second of every day, unless you've been to space, and that's gravity. And if you remember from high school physics, right, the gravitational pull that something exerts is its mass divided by its distance squared. And so since the 1880s, economists have used this notion of gravity, which they also call interactance, to predict trade and migration flows between cities and between countries. And it's often been called the most successful model in economics. So we developed a gravity metric to capture potential market interactions with reefs based on the size and accessibility of the nearest market. Now, we also did something similar for the nearest human settlement, irrespective of the size. So in this case, a market was a port or a provincial capital or a kind of a major city. Well, we also looked for the nearest human settlement, regardless of how big it was. And that was kind of our metric of subsistence or local use. This essentially measures the gravitational pull of a market on a reef. And let's take a look at what we found. So we've got kind of market gravity on the X there and fish biomass on the Y. And you can see at this sort of national scale, quite a tight relationship there. Now, the size of those bubbles are essentially the sample size per country. That's the national average gravity and national average fish biomass there. And what we see is that reefs that are far from markets have about 4 times more fish than reefs that are near markets. And I think this is really critical because markets are expanding into previously remote areas. For example, you guys may have heard that the capital of Indonesia is moving from Jakarta into Borneo, into what basically looks like a little crossroads in the middle of Borneo. In the South China Sea, previously uninhabited coral atolls are being developed. And China's Belt and Road Initiative is the largest infrastructure project in human history, set at reorienting global trade to China. And this includes the development of a new maritime Silk Road, which will include massive development in ports. So we know that markets can have a big impact on the environment. So what can we do to reduce or to dampen their effect? And I think this requires first understanding how markets can lead to exploitation. And I think the standard notion is that markets change price and price variability, and these create incentives for exploitation. And a nice example from Nicaragua is when a paved road increased market access to a fishing village. Before the road was paved, it was impassable in the wet season, so people couldn't get their fish to markets. And so the stable prices from that the paved road created meant that people could move from being seasonal fishermen to full-time fishermen, and that led to more fishing pressure. So look, I buy that. I buy that notion that price and price variability can create these incentives, but I don't think it's the whole story. And I think it's what we're just now learning that's much more interesting, and where I actually believe the potential for fundamental change lies. And there's this emerging body of research from behavioral economics and philosophy that's beginning to study how the very presence of markets can change the way that humans behave, and this can have big impacts on the environment. Let me explain. Much of human behavior is governed by social norms that determine what a society thinks is acceptable or not. What we're finding is that the very presence of markets can crowd out or displace these social norms, often with unforeseen or perverse consequences. Now, let me give you guys an example of this that has nothing whatsoever to do with the environment, but may have relevance to many of you, and is certainly very relevant to me. So this is my little boy Ezra, and he and his brother go to daycare, many kids. And so many daycare centers have problems with parents being late picking up their kids. And so in Israel, some daycare centers decided to do something about it, and they imposed a fine for parents that were late picking up their kids. So as it turns out, the incidence of late pickups nearly doubled. What happened? Well, prior to the fines, social norms made parents feel bad for picking up their kids late. But the fines created the idea of compensation for the extra time, displacing this ethical obligation to be punctual. Now, right, a few extra dollars to finish that latte and catch up on the gossip with your friends is totally worth it. It's just the cost of daycare. And importantly, 3 weeks later, when the fines were reversed, the late incidence of pickups persisted. So once eroded, these moral obligations were hard to revive. So we know that markets can affect 3 areas of human behavior that have direct relevance to conservation. And I think one of the most important ways that markets can crowd out pro-environmental behavior is by reducing people's propensity to engage in collective action or civic duties. And another example from non-environmental example from Israel is that every year school children go and collect money for charities, and they spend a whole day collecting money for charity. Now, using this as the foundation for an experiment, some behavioral economists divided kids into 3 groups. They gave one group a 10% commission on any charity money that they raised. They gave another group a 1% commission, and the third was the control group that just didn't get anything. They just raised money for charity. So contrary to standard economic theory, the latter group did the best, right? In this case, money crowded out the norms of civic duty and changed the character of the activity from a good deed to a job for pay. Here, merely commodifying the service was enough to erode it. So emerging research also suggests that markets can affect people's willingness to inflict direct harm on others. And this is what economists refer to as negative or third-party externalities. And markets can also affect people's preferences for social equity or for fairness. Now, critically, some of these, such as collective action, are the very foundations of most community-based approaches to conservation. And these can be undermined by markets in ways that we're simply not paying attention to. And even worse, right? There's a whole branch of conservation called market-based instruments that create new markets in the provision of environmental goods or in the avoidance of environmental harm. How ironic that these market-based conservation instruments could be eroding the foundations of conservation itself. So I think the key question then is whether or how we can prevent the potential displacement of collective action, of equity, and of intolerance for externalities. And I think the first step in doing this is better understanding the mechanisms through which crowding out occurs. And we've talked a little bit already about internal motivations getting displaced by external motivations. A second key mechanism is this notion of diffusion of responsibility. And when people are engaged in the multilateral transactions that are associated with markets, they sometimes feel that, well, whatever, if I do it, no one will notice, or if I don't do it, someone else will, so what's it really matter? So the type of morality that's associated with sort of what we call bilateral transactions and interactions gets eroded when there's a multilateral situation there. And there's also this notion of framing, which is the principle that our choices are influenced by different wordings and settings and situations. And simply by having a market framing there, people may, feel like they have to, behave like the ruthless Wolf of Wall Street or something, that because they're thinking that that's what they should be doing because they've been framed that way. So the second step then is determining whether we can develop countermeasures that get coupled into conservation initiatives. Can we couple conservation with measures that foster intrinsic motivations or that reinforce individual responsibility? So my research group has started kind of trying to better understand some of these mechanisms by looking at sort of framing and collective action. And as part of my Pew Fellowship, I hired a behavioral economist, Dr. Rojas, to run some field experiments on how markets might crowd out cooperative behavior in a Papua New Guinean fishing village. And we specifically looked at how framing might influence people's level of cooperation using a series of experimental economic games. So the key game that we used here is called a public goods game. And let me just, for those of you that are unfamiliar, let me go through it with you. So typically what happens is you get a series of players in this hypothetical example. There's 3, but usually there's more than that. And so everyone gets a bequeathment. You get an initial amount of money to start with. And you can decide then whether you want to give some or all of that money into a public good. So in this example, everyone's given $6 into the public good. So there's $18 in there. Now, typically that will get multiplied by some factor. So in this case, let's say it gets doubled, it could be tripled or 1.5 or whatever. And then it gets redistributed, but it gets redistributed equally, irrespective of your initial contribution. So in this case, everyone gave $6 and they got $12 back and everyone's thrilled. Well, in another example, player 1 gives $6 again, but players 2 and 3 decide not to give anything. So that then grows to $12 and all the players get $4 back. Player 1's unhappy because they gave $6 and they got $4 back, but players 2 and 3 did nothing and they got $4. So they could almost buy a cup of coffee now. So that's typically the way that the public goods game works. But what we did was an interesting take on this. So we divided this into 3 groups. We had a control group which just played the public goods game, but then we did 2 treatments. And before they played the public goods game, the treatments played either a market game or a trust game. Now, I don't have time to go into the details of these different games, but the point is they were framed with kind of a market situation or a trust situation there. And our hypothesis was that we would see less cooperation in the group that had the market treatment compared to the trust and control groups. In other words, that market framing would spill over into cooperation. So our results were a bit more nuanced than expected. Both the market and trust framing had a big influence on people's level of cooperation, but it actually really mattered what role the person played, whether they were a buyer or a seller in the market game, or whether they were a sender or receiver in the trust game. That strongly influenced their cooperation. In fact, in such a way that it was polar opposite. So the market framing in and of itself had no effect, but that's because the buyer and seller had these really opposite effects. And same with the sender and receiver in the trust game. So that the actual context itself didn't matter, but what role you played within that context mattered a lot. And I think the so what here is that the existence of these behavioral spillovers into public goods can really render conservation initiatives that rely on contributions ineffective if they crowd out this intrinsic behavior. So better understanding this context in which spillover happens is really necessary for the implementation of more effective conservation initiatives. And this is an area I'd certainly like to be delving deeper into in the future. All right, so let's now kind of return back to our bright spots and look at locating our bright spots. Now, we defined bright spots as places that were doing better than expected, given the socioeconomic and environmental conditions they were exposed to. And we had our model, which I talked about before, and that created the basis for our expectations. So we used this to find the places that were doing better than expected. We were essentially looking for the reefs that were punching above their weight. Now, we used 2 standard deviations from our expectations as a conservative definition of an outlier. And if you remember from your first statistics class, that 1 standard deviations were about 2/3 of the data lie, and 2 standard deviations were about 95% of the data lie. So we were looking for the kind of extreme outliers here. So we found our bright spots primarily distributed in the Pacific. They occurred in both remote, but also in populated places. And these included Taboeron, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and parts of Indonesia. Now, one thing I want to emphasize here, because I think people tend to have a hard time getting their head around this, that this is a relative measure of success. It's not absolute. We were not looking for the most remote, pristine places, right? Some of our bright spots had biomass levels that were below the global mean. We also looked at dark spots, and I think these also have really important lessons here, but these lessons are the things you want to avoid. These are places that are doing a lot worse than expected, given the conditions that they're exposed to. Now, for me, what I kind of like about this approach is that it kind of challenges some of our expectations, So, the Caribbean's often considered the sort of basket case of the coral reef world that's meant to be doing terribly. Well, by and large, we found, there was a couple of dark spots there, but we found the Caribbean performed very, very much as we would expect, given the conditions it was exposed to. So is it a basket case? Well, yeah, maybe, but it's a very predictable one. That's what you should get if you have those conditions. Now, interestingly, of the 2 bright spots, one of them is a place that's actually I'm very, very familiar with. In fact, I've spent 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer working in the Montego Bay Marine Park, and that one of the dark spots was actually in the marine park that I worked at, and was about 1.5 kilometers from the house that I actually lived in for 2 years there. So I'm actually I wasn't surprised to see that was a dark spot, because that place in particular was a little bit crazy. We had a number of situations where our marine park rangers would have spear fishermen come to their houses and point spear guns at their wife and kids and tell them to back off, and it was just it was an absolutely crazy situation there. Another expectation that I think this challenge as well was, really remote places like the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, which are often considered like these pristine places. Well, we actually found that they were, some of them were dark spots, not everywhere. There's a lot of spots there, but there's a few dark spots there. So some of the places that are, meant to be the most pristine in the world, we actually found relatively weren't doing as well as we would expect. So now let's talk a little bit more about what makes a bright spot bright. And some of the research on bright spots in agricultural systems has thought about there being three broad factors of enabling conditions. These include environmental conditions, social and institutional conditions, and technological conditions. So as a hypothesis generating exploration, to begin uncovering why bright and dark spots may diverge from expectations, we surveyed data providers who had firsthand knowledge of these sites, or other experts in the field, about the presence or absence of 10 key social and environmental conditions at the 15 bright spots, at the 35 dark spots, and the 14 places that what I call the average sites that had biomass values closest to model expectations. So in terms of environmental conditions, we found that bright spots were more likely to have deep water refuges, which may allow fish and potentially corals to have refuge from some of the environmental or human pressures. We also found that dark spots were more likely to have been exposed to recent, kind of like within the last 5 years, environmental shocks such as bleaching or cyclone. And I think this latter finding is particularly worrisome in the context of climate change, which is likely to lead to increased coral bleaching and also more intense cyclones. We found that dark spots tended to use more intensive netting, which can damage coral habitat. And they also were more likely to have freezers, which allowed people to stockpile fish to then send to the markets. Bright spots were more likely to have communities that were highly dependent on fisheries. And this may seem really counterintuitive, right? You might think, well, shouldn't bright spots have places, shouldn't they be places with low dependence on fisheries, and that's why they'd be bright? But what decades of common property research has shown is that people become much more willing to invest in creative solutions to confronting commons dilemmas when their livelihoods really depend on it. And what we see is really consistent with that body of research. We found that bright spots were more likely to have people, have local people engaged in decision-making processes. And there was a higher incidence of sort of these cultural connections with reefs. And these include things like taboos or marine tenure systems, customary marine tenure systems. Now, what I'd like to do for the rest of the talk is describe some of the research that that we've done, which kind of really delved into one particular bright spot. And this is going to really focus on high levels of engagement in these cultural practices. And so this bright spot is in Papua New Guinea on a place called Karkar Island. And Karkar Island is that place, like if you just kind of close your eyes for a second and think of like a tropical island, this is it, right? Like it's a volcano that rises up out of the middle of the sea. In the middle of the crater of the volcano is like another volcano that's active and spewing lava. There's like incredible mountains and insanely beautiful coral reefs there. I would go as far to say is that I think it's my favorite place on the planet there. And so that's probably why I've been collecting social and ecological data there since 2001. Now, the interesting thing about this part of Karkar is that they employ a rotational closure system. Now, this system means that it's closed somewhere between 2 and 8 years. And it's important to know that they don't set out and say, okay, we're going to close it for 3 years this time. That's not how it works there. They pay attention to sort of what they view as signals from the environment and from people, and they kind of say, okay, it's time to close the reef, and it's an issue of constant monitoring and evaluation. And when is it time to open the reef? when it's time to open the reef, right? That's the way they that's the way they do it there. Now, this is also practiced by the neighboring community, which creates an interesting design. Let me show you. So these are the two villages, Malouk on the north and Wadao on the south there. And so here the dots are our ecological study sites. Those are the places we've been surveying. And so when we went to start doing work here in 2001, the reefs in front of Malouk were all closed to fishing, but the reefs in front of Wadao were all open to fishing. You could go fishing there. In 2009, when we went back, it was the same thing. Although Malouk had opened the reefs for about 2 weeks, they then closed it again after the death of one of the village chiefs. So it had been largely closed except for 2 weeks during that whole time. And the reefs in front of Wadao were still open to fishing. In 2012, when we went back, the reefs in front of Malouk were open to fishing, but Wadao were closed to fishing. In 2016, Wadao's reefs were then open to fishing and Malouk's reefs were closed to fishing. And in 2017, all the reefs were open. There was no place that was closed to fishing. Now, what we found was that there was more than double the biomass of fish when reefs were closed to fishing relative to when it was open. But that wasn't the main goal. People's stated goal of having this closure was to change fishing behavior in order to make fishing easier. And they said that if we leave the reef alone for a while, the fish allow us to get closer and it becomes easier to kill fish. So we decided to test that. And I actually got a PhD student, and he liked to jokingly refer to his thesis as frightening fish for science. And what he would do is measure how close you could get to a fish before it swam off. And this is what we call approach or flight initiation distance. So in Malouk, what we found was that the flight initiation distance increased from 8 to 11.5 feet when fishing was allowed. And in Wadao, when they closed the reef, the flight initiation distance decreased from 13 to 9 feet. So, fish were flightier when fishing was allowed. This perhaps isn't all that surprising, but I think the cool bit here is that the average spearfishing distance was about 10 feet, right? So fish tended to stay just outside of the range of the kind of spearfishing, but when fishing was prohibited, they kind of went within that range. Now, I should point out that that's the average distance and the average spear gun. So this didn't mean that nobody ever got spearfishing when reefs were open to fishing, but just that it was quite a bit harder. But the key thing, I think, is that when there was a fishing ban in place and that ban got lifted, people could really clean up. And they did, right? The opening was marked by a really large harvest to provide fish for a ceremony. And people from the surrounding villages were invited. Now, you have to understand that in Papua New Guinea, wealth is measured by what you give away, not by what you own. So there's massive social prestige in kind of hosting this, this type of ceremony and being able to gift fish. So we asked people how beneficial they thought this system was to their livelihoods. And what we can see here, what this basically says is, this is a kind of a Likert scale ranging from very detrimental to very beneficial. So about 65%, more than 65% of people in 2009 in Malouk said it was beneficial for their livelihoods. About 10% said it was slightly negative, right? And about 25% said it was neutral. Right, it was kind of neither good nor bad for their livelihoods. And I'll just emphasize again, that was when it was closed to fishing. When we went back in 2012, what we saw was in Malouk, those negative perceptions had gone away. There was not a single respondent that said it was bad for their livelihoods. There was slightly more positive sentiments. But in Wadao, which had then had a closed reef, it looked a lot like Malouk did in 2009. So there was a few, whatever, about 10% of people that said it was negative, and about 2/3 of people said it was positive, and around a quarter of people said it was neither negative or positive. Now, interestingly, when we went back in 2016 and things were reversed again, and Malouk's reefs were closed, we saw again another incidence of there being some negative perceptions, but in Wadao, which was now open, those negative perceptions had gone away. So what we're really seeing is that these negative perceptions were only there when the closure is active. What is going on here? I think this could be explained by some insights from social psychology. Now, the first clue in this, I think, is that the opening was marked by large harvest events and better fishing for a time, right? So you get this big event where you get to give fish to a lot of people and get a lot of social prestige from it. But also when you go fishing, it's easier to catch fish, right? Well, in psychology, there's something known as the peak end rule, or the what they call the peak end heuristic. And this is also known as duration neglect. And what it gets at is that there's a distinction between what people experience and what they remember. And people often only remember the ending of things, whether it's meals or pain. And when that's pleasant, they have fonder memories of the entire experience, regardless of the duration. Now, the classic example of this comes from a rather uncomfortable situation or study, colonoscopies. Now, Danny Kahneman, who's a Nobel, he won the Nobel Prize in economics, even though he's not an economist, was working with some physicians to improve return visitation rates for people that had received colonoscopies. Now, I think things with colonoscopies are probably better now because I think you go under general anesthetic and so you're not awake for it. But back in the day, it was a really awful experience. And so you were awake the whole time and it was really unpleasant. And people that received colonoscopies, they didn't ever want to see that doctor again, basically. So they would just not go back for return visits. And that's actually a real problem in the medical profession. So Kahneman had an idea, and he said, what we're going to do is increase the amount of pain that these people experience. What we're going to do is we're going to break it into two groups, a control group and the experimental group. And in the experimental group, what I want you to do is, when you're done with the procedure, do the procedure exactly the same, but when you're done, leave the scope inside for an additional 90 seconds. So it's the same amount of pain that they've had, plus 90 seconds of what was more a lot of discomfort. It wasn't really painful, but it was really uncomfortable. And what happened was this experimental group, who had more pain overall, right? They had the 90 seconds, they had the whole procedure plus an additional 90 seconds of being uncomfortable. Remember the entire experience as being less unpleasant, and were much more likely to go back for follow-up visits, right? This actually creates a moral conundrum for physicians, right? Because they've got the Hippocratic Oath, which is do no harm. And so they're actually putting their patients through unnecessary pain and discomfort, yet receiving those patients are actually getting better medical outcomes in the end. So that created some moral issues there. But we think that that's what we saw here, was that there was this peak end heuristic, which enabled the community to, even though there were some negative perceptions while the closure was active, once the closure was done and people were able to go fishing again, the improved harvests, even though it was short term, and the ceremony allowed people this positive memory of the ending of the experience, which was then make them more likely to sign up to have this closure again next time. Well, we actually asked people, why did they think their village was a bright spot? We asked them, in the same way that in the Save the Children example I gave, they asked the mothers what they were doing differently from other mothers. We actually asked people what made their villages unique, what made this part of Karkar different from all the other places. And they talked about 4 interrelated themes, which I'll go over briefly. And one of the themes was this notion of having these unique customs. And one of those I've discussed already, this rotational closure system. Well, they also had a fishing initiation custom, which was really unique to that part of the island. And you can see it illustrated here in this photo. They were just kind of mocking up the event for me here to take a picture of. But this is what's called bonbon fishing. And basically one guy's the paddler, and one guy grabs, he's got a torch in one hand and a 3 or 5 pronged harpoon in the other hand. And during the right time of the month, flying fish will come up to investigate the light, and the guy will spear flying fish basically out of the air with that. Now, the thing is, with this type of fishing, not anyone can just do it. You have to be initiated into this like 3-day initiation ceremony, which I've actually witnessed before. And so, yeah, basically not everyone can do it. You have to be initiated, and it's only for people that they kind of feel are being kind of like good citizens, that are being good community members. Those are the ones that get initiated. If you're kind of a troublemaker, you won't be able to get initiated into this. And I'll also note that both the rotational closure and the fishing initiation ceremonies are enabled by a customary foundation of marine tenure, which creates property rights, right? So rotational closure system is no use if you can't actually exclude people from it, if you can't exclude outsiders or even legally exclude people even within your in-group. Now, the second thing that people talked about was that people complied with the rules. And it's kind of my words here, the carrot and stick approach that they use. We talked a little bit about the carrot before, which was this notion of people that follow the rules get extra benefits. They get to get initiated into this really prestigious fishery, this bonbon fishery. The stick approach is actually that when people would transgress and break the rules, they would get called out very publicly in community meetings. And we are, as humans, really hardwired to avoid that kind of social shame. So that's actually a really big deal. I mean, that works because it's kind of a smaller community and everyone kind of knows each other. But they were able to kind of leverage this cognitive bias that we have, well, this feeling of so that they were able to harness one of our social influence levers to encourage compliance. They also talked a lot about high levels of participation, and this is both in the kind of adaptive decision-making required for this rotational closure, right? And also that there was a number of social gatherings, that they have, weekly meetings, they have these events after they've closed or after they've opened a closure. So there's a lot of kind of social contact there. And that then creates strong social capital. And one of the real interesting parts of the strong social capital that we investigated was strong youth elder ties. Now, my wife, who you saw the picture of earlier, is a social network scientist, and she studied these tight knowledge and information exchange networks that were flowing between elders and youth in this area. And that's actually not common amongst many fishing villages. It tends to be a real kind of age breakdown. And that's because of what we refer to as homophily, the people that tend to form ties with people that are very similar to themselves. And that was quite different here. We saw people forming knowledge exchange ties between age cohorts. Oops. And so the one thing I'll note here is that none of these are unique and all of these are reinforcing, right? They kind of complement each other and one relies on the other there. All right, so kind of what's next for me? What am I interested in doing next? Well, the bright spots work that I did was really interesting, but it was very static. We took one snapshot in time and looked at, we were able to sort of predict, what that static state should be given the environmental conditions, but I'm much more interested in looking at responses to big changes. For example, the global coral bleaching event of 2016. And instead of looking at what state they're in, looking at their resilience, their ability to either resist or to recover from events like this. And so this is what's been referred to as exceptional responders. And this is a big deal in medicine, and particularly fields like oncology. There's a small minority of patients that have these remarkable responses to drug therapy. You may find in a trial 1 or 2 people respond and make a complete recovery, whereas nobody else does. And what they're able to do is go in and study their sort of genome and metabolome, and transcriptome, and better understand what kind of, whether they've got sort of genetic mutations. And they found in some cases, for example, there was one patient who was repeatedly exposed to HIV, but never caught it. And they realized that he had a specific mutation, which became the basis for one of the main HIV treatments. They studied this mutation, found out how it prevented infections, and were able to create a drug that mimicked that. So in 2017, groups like Harvard have launched this exceptional responders group designed to systematically study exceptional responders. There's projects in Australia and in Europe as well. And I think that's what we need to be doing in coral reef science. Which reefs are recovering remarkably, which are doing worse, right? So that's kind of the direction I'm hoping to go with that. All right, so some of the real quick take-home messages from this, I think, we need to embrace a broader range of potential policy levers. Markets were the strongest driver of change in reef fish biomass, but are largely an untapped focus of reef governments. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to dampen the effects of markets by coupling conservation with countermeasures, again, to reinforce individual responsibility, for example. There's the potential to learn from places that have effectively confronted these strong drivers of change. I would argue that the specific practice that we studied, that I gave you guys that detailed example of, this rotational closure system, probably isn't applicable everywhere, but there were some transferable lessons there, right? There's the benefits of having a system of property rights, of encouraging strong and just participation, of leveraging social norms to encourage more pro-environmental practices. And, I think lastly, it involves things like working together. I work very closely with people like Aaron Neal, who's really changed the way that I think about a lot of these problems, and that has a lot of benefits. So, working together with people really outside of your discipline and thinking outside the box. How can we harness things like the peak end rule in conservation? I think these are the directions that we need to be heading as a community. So with that, I would just like to say thanks to my family, to my social ecological research frontiers team, and my research group. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions.